November 24, 1971. A cold evening. Flight 305, a routine commuter jet, lifts off from Portland, Oregon, bound for Seattle. 36 passengers and 6 crew members settle in for what should have been a quiet, uneventful journey through the Pacific Northwest sky. Unbeknownst to them, a single man in the last row carries with him a plan that will redefine the limits of airline security and expose the vulnerabilities of a nation. Airline hijackings, or skyjackings, had become an alarming phenomenon in late 1960s and early 1970s America. In the years leading up to this night, more than 130 hijackings occurred across the United States. Some hijackers sought political asylum, others demanded ransom, but all wielded the threat of deadly force to bend the rules of the sky. Punishments for air piracy were harsh by legal standards of the era. Under Title 49 of the United States Code, aircraft hijacking was a federal crime, punishable by up to 20 years in prison life if death resulted. In especially grave cases, federal prosecutors could pursue the death penalty. The U.S. government treated air piracy not just as a crime, but as an act of terror and war against civilian order. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Aviation Administration responded to each hijacking with escalating countermeasures. Emergency response protocols involved immediate communication with law enforcement, rapid coordination with the FBI, and compliance with the demands of hijackers to preserve innocent lives. The threat of punishment hung over every would-be skyjacker. Publicized convictions, long prison terms, and the knowledge that federal agents would pursue suspects for decades. In the rare event that a hijacker evaded justice, their name became synonymous with infamy but also placed them among the most hunted fugitives in modern history. Aboard Flight 305, the system designed to prevent and punish such acts was not yet fully matured. Pre-boarding security was minimal. No metal detectors, no identification checks for domestic passengers. The concept of sky marshal programs was still in its infancy, and the idea of random baggage screening had yet to become routine. This vulnerability was not lost on policymakers, and every successful hijacking intensified public demand for reform. The message of each hijacking was clear: the skies were no longer safe, and those who breached this trust would face the full weight of federal prosecution. The psychological impact on the nation was profound. Families began to fear flying. Airlines quietly revised internal policies, knowing that the threat of hijacking and the punishments that followed were now part of the new reality of commercial aviation. By the end of 1972, just 1 year after the D.B. Cooper incident, Congress enacted new legislation mandating universal passenger screening at American airports. The FAA and Department of Transportation established more stringent rules, including mandatory searches and the use of armed federal air marshals. The system of punishment and deterrence had shifted, no longer reactive, but preemptive. The story of Flight 305 stands not only as a mystery, but as a turning point in the legal and psychological landscape of American air travel. The punishments for such crimes would only grow more severe. The intent was unambiguous: to send a message, through prosecution and policy, that those who threatened the safety of the skies would face consequences that echoed far beyond the walls of any courtroom. As Flight 305 levels out above the clouds, one man sits alone in seat 180, Dan Cooper. An alias, he blends in, but his intentions do not. In the United States of the early 1970s, the threat of aircraft hijacking is not new. Just 3 years earlier, in 1968, a wave of skyjackings began sweeping across America. Commercial airliners became targets for ransom, escape, and political bargaining. By the time Cooper boards this plane, the United States has faced over 100 such incidents. Each one tests the boundaries of justice and consequence. The U.S. government, driven by the need to restore order and protect its citizens, turns to the law as a weapon. In 1961, Congress amends the Federal Aviation Act making aircraft piracy a federal crime. Those found guilty face up to 20 years in prison. The stakes are raised higher if a weapon is used, or if anyone is injured or killed. The maximum sentence becomes life imprisonment, and in the gravest cases, death. The law is enforced by federal courts. Sentencing is carried out in U.S. penitentiaries, where convicted hijackers serve years, often decades, behind bars. In rare cases, sentences exceed the span of a natural life, intended as a deterrent as much as a penalty. Hijackers who survive capture encounter a justice system engineered to send a message. Their names and faces become symbols in the national media. Publicized convictions aim to reassure the public and warn others. In 1969, Rafael Minichiello hijacks TWA Flight 85 and is sentenced to 20 years, his story marked by courtroom drama and international headlines. In 1972, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. commits an almost identical hijacking to Cooper's, is swiftly arrested, and receives a 45-year sentence in federal prison. These cases reflect a society determined to demonstrate that the sky is not lawless, that every act of defiance against airline security brings consequences that are inescapable, even if delayed. The methods of punishment are not limited to incarceration. The symbolism is calculated. Maximum security prisons become part of the machinery of deterrence. Public records detail the isolation, the restrictions, and the psychological toll exacted on those convicted. Letters, visitation, even outdoor exercise. These privileges are limited, and every measure is meant to break the resolve of those who threaten public safety. Enforcement is relentless. The FBI, tasked with investigating hijackings, tracks suspects for years. Cases remain open until the fugitive is captured or confirmed dead. The message is clear. The act of hijacking an aircraft is not a crime that fades from memory. Justice, as the government defines it, will follow the perpetrator across years, borders, and changing administrations. The broader impact of these punishments is felt in the evolution of policy. In the aftermath of high-profile skyjackings, airport security transforms. By 1973, mandatory screening, metal detectors, and armed sky marshals are implemented nationwide. The system of punishment extends from the courtroom to the checkpoint, embedding the threat of consequence into every stage of air travel. Seat 18E is a vantage point not just for the man who called himself Dan Cooper, but for the nation itself, forced to confront the reality that punishment is as much about prevention as retribution. In the end, the man in Seat 18 East becomes a catalyst, accelerating a new era of security and consequences in the sky. The punishments for those who follow would become infamous, shaping the modern meaning of justice for air piracy in America. Florence Schaffner, a 23-year-old flight attendant, receives a folded note from the man in Seat 18E. She assumes another routine interaction. The reality is different. The words on the paper have a bomb represent not only a threat to the aircraft, but a violation of federal law, one that will trigger the full machinery of justice in the United States. By the early 1970s, American law treated threats of violence on commercial airliners as crimes of the highest order. Under the Federal Aviation Act of 1958, amended in 1961, anyone who threatened the safety of an aircraft, crew, or passengers, whether or not they followed through, could face decades in federal prison. If a weapon was brandished, or if violence occurred, the charges escalated. The potential for the death penalty existed in cases where a death resulted from such threats or actions. The symbolism of this punishment was clear. The government intended to deter not only violence, but even the threat of violence in the controlled, confined space of an aircraft. Airline hijacking and the use of explosive threats were prosecuted as federal crimes, adjudicated in U.S. district courts, often in the jurisdiction where the aircraft landed or the crime was discovered. In high-profile cases, sentences became part of the national conversation. In 1970, Raffaele Minichiello was sentenced to 20 years for a skyjacking that involved both a weapon and a threat to detonate explosives. The public learned, through these trials, the costs of crossing the invisible line between passenger and perpetrator. Enforcement extended well beyond arrest and sentencing. The FBI took the lead in hijacking investigations, working closely with airport police, the FAA, and, when flights crossed borders, Interpol. Once in custody, accused hijackers could be held without bail, tried in federal court, and if convicted transferred to high-security penitentiaries such as Leavenworth, Marion, or Alcatraz. The prospect of decades in isolation, far from family and society, served a dual function: retribution for the crime and deterrence for others. Punishment in these cases had a psychological as well as a physical dimension. Defendants were often held in solitary confinement, under constant surveillance. The aim was to remove any sense of notoriety or heroism, and to reinforce the consequences of using fear as a weapon. The message was unambiguous: the federal government would not negotiate with, nor show leniency to, those who endangered public safety through threats of violence. The threat of a bomb, even if false, triggered lasting changes. In response to a surge in such incidents, U.S. airports introduced new screening procedures in 1972. Metal detectors, X-ray scanners, and armed air marshals became standard. Airline personnel were trained to detect suspicious behavior and respond according to federal protocols. Every threat, real or imagined, was met with forceful response and the knowledge that federal law would pursue the case to its conclusion. The penalties for such crimes did not end with prison sentences. Convicted hijackers were often denied parole and stripped of civil rights. Their names became a warning, used in FAA and FBI training for years to come. The possibility of ever rejoining society faded as the full weight of federal punishment came to bear. The bomb threat in the hands of a single man becomes a catalyst for systemic change. The punishment is designed to be not just severe, but unforgettable, a statement to anyone who might contemplate similar acts in the future. In the confined space of a jetliner, one note is all it takes to summon the darkest tools of justice. At 10,000 feet, the calm voice of Dan Cooper echoes his intentions. $200,000 in small bills, for parachutes, a fuel truck, to stand ready on the Seattle tarmac. The warning is unmistakable: any deception, any failure, and he will detonate the bomb in his briefcase. In the confined world of an airliner, his demands turn the aircraft into a stage for one of the most serious federal crimes in American law: aircraft piracy, under threat of mass violence. By the early 1970s, extortion through aircraft hijacking was not only common, it was feared. The Federal Aviation Act, revised in 1961, elevated the punishment for air piracy to a new level. The moment a demand is made under threat of violence, hijackers become subject to prosecution by the United States government. The sentence is severe, up to life in prison for any act of air piracy, and, if fatalities result, eligibility for capital punishment. These legal provisions are not symbolic, they are rigorously enforced. Federal authorities view hijacking as an act of terrorism, a direct challenge to the authority of the state and the safety of its people. Enforcement relies on a strict system of response and investigation. The moment Cooper issues his demands, the cockpit contacts ground authorities. Air traffic control relays the threat to the FBI. Agents are mobilized. The chain of command is clear. The safety of passengers takes precedence, but compliance is not an admission of weakness. It is a calculated move to preserve life and ensure the perpetrator faces trial. The legal message is reinforced in every official communication: negotiation does not prevent prosecution. In the years before this flight, hijackers such as Albert D. Wills and James E. Johnson faced swift arrest and prosecution. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life. There is no ambiguity in the eyes of the law. The psychological toll of these threats extends beyond the victims. Airlines, pressured by public fear and government mandate, comply out of necessity. Yet every incident results in tighter security, more invasive screening, and changes to cockpit procedures. Pilots and crew undergo regular training for crisis management. They are briefed on the federal statutes that govern air piracy and extortion, fully aware that any decision made at altitude will be scrutinized in courtrooms and official inquiries. The symbolism of Cooper's demands is unmistakable. Cash ransom transforms the hijacking into a public spectacle. Parachutes invoke the possibility of escape, a challenge to the idea that the law can contain or deter. The presence of a bomb raises the stakes to absolute. In response, the United States government reinforces its commitment to prosecution and deterrence. The threat of severe, lifelong punishment is designed to project power and unambiguous warning to any would-be imitator. In the wake of such incidents, the American legal system adapts. By 1974, Congress passes the Anti-Hijacking Act, allowing for international cooperation and further toughening penalties. Sentences become more severe. Jurisdictions are expanded. The use of threats, even without actual violence, becomes enough to guarantee decades behind bars. The message is embedded not only in the law, but in the architecture of airports, the vigilance of aircrews, and the collective memory of the flying public. Every detail of Cooper's demands is documented, analyzed, and archived by federal investigators. For the rest of the century, his case will define the intersection of extortion, terror, and punishment in the history of flight. The legacy of these demands is a justice system that responds to threats with overwhelming force, determined to ensure that the consequences of air piracy are as haunting as the crime itself. Seattle's city lights flicker beneath the clouds as Flight 305 carves endless circles above the region. Each turn marks another minute of high-stakes negotiation. On the ground, federal agents scramble. The airline's president, Donald Nyrup, gives a directive rarely heard in the history of American aviation: comply with every demand, preserve the company's reputation, but above all, prevent the loss of life. Behind this order lies the shadow of federal law. In 1971, the United States recognizes hijacking not only as a crime against property, but as an existential threat to civil aviation. The Federal Aviation Act of 1958, reinforced by amendments throughout the 60s, empowers the FBI to act decisively. Aircraft piracy is a federal felony punishable by up to 20 years in prison, or life if injury or death occurs. In exceptional circumstances, the death penalty remains on the books. These sentences, prosecuted in federal court, are meant to communicate the seriousness of any such act to both the perpetrator and the public. Every moment the plane circles, the authorities balance to realities. Compliance may encourage copycats, but resistance risks the lives of dozens. In previous hijackings, swift and uncompromising justice has been used as a tool of deterrence. In 1969, for example, Lester Perry and Jean Robert Turner, both sentenced to extended prison terms after unsuccessful attempts at extortion through hijacking. Their cases, publicized in the media, serve as warnings to others. Yet, on this night, officials weigh the immediate risk to life above the future deterrent effect. Inside the aircraft, the tension is felt most acutely by the crew. They are aware that every decision could carry consequences both for those on board and in courtrooms later. Airline protocols dictate full cooperation, but all actions are meticulously logged and reported to law enforcement. The potential for prosecution does not end with the hijacker. Investigations probe every level of response, ensuring that no one passenger, crew, or executive acts outside the bounds of federal law. For the passengers, ignorance is a shield. They remain unaware, believing only that technical delays keep them in the sky. This, too, is by design. Minimizing panic reduces the chance of escalation, a calculated measure for preserving order and evidence. The authorities on the ground know that every minute in the air another chance to prepare for a peaceful resolution and for the apprehension and eventual punishment of the perpetrator. The psychological impact of this ordeal extends far beyond the duration of the flight. Pilots, flight attendants, and even ground staff undergo federal debriefings, with every word and action scrutinized. The airline itself faces investigations by regulatory agencies, with potential penalties for any failure in protocol. The aftermath often includes not only criminal prosecution, but also civil suits, public hearings, and long-term professional consequences. The circling of Seattle is more than a delay, it is a negotiation with the machinery of justice, a high-altitude calculation of risk, consequence, and the reach of federal punishment. By the end of the night, the fate of everyone involved will be shaped by the intersection of law, reputation, and the enduring power of deterrence in the history of flight. Flight 305 descends under a heavy shroud of secrecy. The aircraft parks at the far edge of Seattle-Tacoma Airport, isolated from public view by Cooper's demand. Law enforcement and airline officials move methodically. A representative walks across the tarmac, a duffel bag of $200,000 and for parachutes in hand. Every bill inside the bag has been meticulously recorded by FBI agents, each serial number entered into a national database. The transaction takes place in silence, its gravity underscored by the knowledge that this exchange money for lives stands as one of the rarest, most dangerous events in commercial aviation history. The passengers disembark, shielded from the truth of what has transpired. Most of the crew is released. The cabin is left to a skeleton staff, Cooper, Tina Mucklow, and the pilots. This division between hostage and released marks a turning point, both for the individuals involved and for the legal consequences that follow. Under United States federal law, extortion by threat of violence aboard an aircraft is prosecuted as a felony, subject to the harsher sentences available. In this era, ransom demands made under threat of mass casualty are categorized alongside acts of terrorism and treason. Maximum punishment includes life in prison without parole. In rare cases where death occurs, capital punishment remains a legal option. The severity of the law is meant to send a message: these acts will not be tolerated, and those responsible will face unrelenting pursuit. The exchange itself is tightly managed by law enforcement. Negotiators balance the need for safe resolution against the imperative to collect evidence. Serial numbers, fingerprints, and transaction records are meticulously preserved, ensuring that the investigation can continue long after the flight is over. The moment the ransom is delivered, the focus of justice shifts from negotiation to prosecution. If and when the perpetrator is caught, federal prosecutors use every detail of the threat, the demand, the method of escape as aggravating factors at sentencing. In previous cases, hijackers who received ransom money were tracked for years. Authorities in the United States and abroad cooperate through Interpol and the International Civil Aviation Organization, working to retrieve the funds and apprehend suspects across borders. The use of parachutes in Cooper's demand introduces a rare and unsettling dimension to the crime. Authorities recognize the intention to evade capture and to challenge the reach of the law. Historically, such tactics are seen as an affront to the entire system of deterrence. In response, federal punishment is not limited to the act itself. Sentencing enhancements include additional years for using equipment to facilitate escape and for placing flight crews and passengers in jeopardy. In 1972, just months after the Cooper incident, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. attempts a nearly identical crime. He is apprehended, convicted, and sentenced to 45 years in prison. The emotional impact lingers for those who remain on board. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow and the pilots are required to continue their roles under threat, knowing the situation could escalate at any moment. Their actions are later documented, reviewed in federal hearings, and used to update safety protocols. For future hijackings, the ransom exchange on the tarmac is more than a transaction. It is a confrontation between a single individual and the machinery of federal injustice, a moment that redefines security policy, hardens punishment, and leaves a legacy that will resonate in courtrooms and law enforcement agencies for decades to come. The engines of Flight 305 roar once more, this time cutting a deliberate path south, bound for Mexico City. Dan Cooper issues precise instructions: maintain an altitude of 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear deployed, and fly at the slowest possible speed. These demands are not arbitrary, they are calculated to facilitate a mid-air escape, the kind that transforms a crime into legend and tests the reach of the law. As the aircraft rises into the turbulent night, rain and wind buffet the fuselage. In the cabin, Cooper readies his escape. He selects 2 of the 4 parachutes, removes the money-laden bag, and moves toward the rear of the plane. The pilots, sealed in the cockpit under strict orders, can only monitor the situation through warning lights. Suddenly, a signal flashes: the aft staircase has been deployed. The maneuver, possible only on a Boeing 727, is unprecedented in commercial aviation history. It is a moment that will be studied by investigators and lawmakers for decades. The jump itself crosses more than physical boundaries. In the eyes of federal law, Cooper's escape is not only an act of air piracy and extortion, but also a direct defiance of national and international justice. The 1963 Tokyo Convention and the 1970 Hague Convention, both signed by the United States, mandate the prosecution and extradition of hijackers, regardless of where they flee. Cooper's leap into the darkness places him at the intersection of multiple legal systems. Should he survive and surface abroad, these treaties obligate nations to arrest and return him for trial. Historically, attempts to evade justice through aerial escape have been met with severe consequences. In 1972, just months after the Cooper hijacking, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. attempts a similar escape using a parachute. He is captured, tried in federal court, and sentenced to 45 years in prison. His case, and others like it, reinforce the principle that neither distance nor ingenuity shields offenders from prosecution. The law is explicit: anyone who escapes custody or uses means of escape during the commission of a federal crime faces additional years added to their sentence, often served consecutively. The symbolism of Cooper's escape resonates through every agency involved. The FBI launches one of the most extensive manhunts in its history. Thousands of leads are investigated. Rivers, forests, and rural communities in Washington and Oregon become the focus of an unprecedented search. International law enforcement agencies are notified. The serial numbers of the ransom bills are circulated worldwide. The escape does not close the case, it amplifies its significance. The psychological impact of the escape is profound. For flight crews, airlines, and the flying public, the notion that a hijacker can vanish into the night challenges the perceived safety of commercial aviation. The case becomes a catalyst for sweeping changes. Boeing modifies aircraft to prevent in-flight stare deployment, and the FAA mandates new anti-hijacking security measures. Cooper's leap into the unknown is more than an act of personal defiance. It is a confrontation with the entire architecture of legal authority, both national and international. The punishment for such an escape is not simply incarceration. It is a life pursued, an existence defined by evasion, and a legacy that shapes the future of aviation security. His escape remains a singular moment in criminal history, a challenge to the system that responded with every tool of justice at its disposal. Flight 305 lands in Reno under floodlights and armed watch. The cabin is empty except for remnants: a black clip-on tie, a few cigarette butts, and 66 unidentified fingerprints. Dan Cooper has vanished into the cold Nevada night, leaving only evidence and questions behind. For the first time in American aviation history, a skyjacker has disappeared without a trace, and the search that follows sets a new standard for federal investigation. Within hours, The Federal Bureau of Investigation assumes control. Agents collect every fragment left aboard the aircraft, sending items to forensic labs for analysis. The black tie is dusted for DNA and fibers. Cigarette butts are examined for saliva and chemical traces. Each fingerprint is cataloged, compared against thousands of records in federal databases. Every detail becomes part of an expanding dossier, the starting point for what becomes one of the most exhaustive manhunts in the FBI's history. Law enforcement mobilizes across the states. Search teams sweep the forests and riverbanks of Washington and Oregon, deploying helicopters, dogs, and boats. Local police interview residents and coordinate with state troopers. The Civil Air Patrol flies low over suspected drop zones, scanning for parachute fabric or money. The hope is to find evidence: a torn bill, a spent parachute, or a body. The possibility that Cooper did not survive the jump lingers, but without proof, the manhunt cannot close. Federal agencies act with unprecedented reach. The serial numbers of every $20 bill in the ransom are distributed to banks, casinos, and merchants nationwide. The United States Secret Service joins the effort, as the stolen funds are technically government property. Alerts cross international borders through Interpol and the International Civil Aviation Organization. Airlines receive bulletins outlining new procedures for handling similar crimes. FBI field offices dedicate agents to every lead, regardless of how improbable. For years, investigators track rumors, sightings, and suspects from Seattle to South America. The legal consequences for hijacking, extortion, and escape are harsh and unyielding. Federal statutes dictate that fugitives will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law regardless of the passage of time. Sentences for air piracy, aggravated by the use of threats and violence, can extend to life imprisonment without parole. The symbolism is clear. Vanishing into the wilderness does not mean escaping the reach of American justice. The case remains open, with a standing warrant for Dan Cooper's arrest. The investigation sets a precedent. Hijacking will bring relentless pursuit and, when possible, severe punishment. The psychological effect of the hunt reverberates through law enforcement and the public alike. Flight crews undergo new training. The public grows wary, fueling support for tighter airport security and tougher sentencing. Lawmakers cite the Cooper case in hearings on aviation security, pressing for technological and procedural reforms. Years pass, leads grow cold, but the file stays open. The black tie, cigarette butts, and fingerprints remain locked in FBI evidence rooms, a permanent reminder of a crime that defied conventional response and forced a new era in the battle between crime and punishment in the skies. He ransom paid to Dan Cooper on that November night is not ordinary currency. Each bill is a $20 denomination, carefully marked and cataloged by federal agents before being handed over. 10,000 bills, totaling $200,000, their serial numbers entered into national law enforcement databases. This detail transforms the ransom from mere cash to an enduring piece of evidence, money that will haunt banks, casinos, and storefronts for years to come. As soon as the aircraft leaves Seattle, the FBI puts its money tracing protocol into motion. Lists of serial numbers are dispatched to financial institutions, law enforcement agencies, and commercial businesses across the United States. Bank tellers and cashiers receive posters instructing them to be vigilant. The use of marked money is meant to strangle any attempt at laundering and to ensure that, even if Cooper escapes, his bounty remains radioactive, dangerous to spend, a link back to his crime. For years, the search for these bills dominates the investigation. Every suspicious deposit, every report of unusual $20 bills, triggers review and follow-up. Agents canvass casinos, border crossings, and banks from Washington to Nevada and beyond. The hope is to catch Cooper, or his associates, as soon as they attempt to introduce the money into circulation. But as time passes and none of the bills are found, new theories emerge. Did Cooper lose the money during the jump? Did he bury it, abandon it, or perish with it in the wilderness? In February 1980, the investigation takes an unexpected turn. On a stretch of riverbank along the Columbia River, 8-year-old Brian Ingram digs a hole in the sand and discovers 3 rotting bundles of $20 bills, still wrapped in rubber bands. The bills total $5,800, decayed but legible. The serial numbers are a match. This is Cooper's ransom, unearthed nearly 20 miles downstream from the suspected jump zone. The find prompts new searches of the river and surrounding forest. Law enforcement, divers, and forensic teams scour the area for additional money, a parachute, or remains. Nothing else is found. The discovery deepens the mystery. The FBI analyzes the bundles for clues. The bills show signs of water damage and decay, suggesting they had been buried or submerged for years. The exact path the money took from the sky to the riverbank is never determined. Did Cooper intend to hide the money, or was it swept away by the elements? The rest of the ransom remains unaccounted for. As of today, no other bills from the D.B. Cooper ransom have entered circulation. Decades later, collectors pay high prices for even a single $20 note. Relics of a crime that captivated the world, the fate of the ransom is more than an unanswered question. It underscores the challenges of crime and punishment at the edge of possibility. The system of marking and tracking money, so effective in theory, cannot guarantee recovery or conviction. The money trail remains a silent witness, a testament to the limits and the reach of American justice. The question of D.B. Cooper's identity becomes an obsession for law enforcement. With the hijacker vanished and the money trail gone cold, the investigation shifts to faces, names, and histories. The FBI assembles a team dedicated to tracking every possible lead. More than 800 suspects are cataloged, each with a file, a photograph, and a reason for suspicion. Patterns emerge in the investigation. Many suspects are former military personnel, men trained in parachuting, survival, and aviation. The circumstances of the crime suggest familiarity with aircraft systems and the unique configuration of the Boeing 727. The FBI interviews ex-paratroopers, engineers, pilots, and criminals with aviation backgrounds. Some have connections to the Pacific Northwest. Others have criminal records for extortion, robbery, or forgery. Composite sketches, created from eyewitness accounts, circulate nationwide. Over the years, several suspects seem to fit the profile perfectly. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a decorated Vietnam veteran, is arrested in 1972 for a near-identical hijacking involving a parachute escape. His methods and appearance are strikingly similar, but McCoy's alibi for the night of the Cooper hijacking holds. He is ultimately ruled out, but his case underlines the seriousness with which law enforcement pursues each lead. Other names rise to the surface. Dwayne Weber, who confessed to being Cooper on his deathbed. Kenneth Christensen, a former airline employee with both motive and opportunity. Robert Rackstraw, an ex-soldier and pilot with a history of fraud. Each theory generates headlines, books, and debate. Each new claim adds fuel to the legend, but none produce definitive proof. The process is meticulous. Handwriting samples, DNA testing, and fingerprint analysis are used to eliminate suspects. Family members are interviewed. Alibis are checked. The investigation stretches for decades as technology advances and cold case units revisit old evidence. Still, no suspect is ever charged, tried, or punished for the hijacking of Flight 305. The search for Cooper becomes a symbol of the limits of forensic science and the enduring challenge of justice in cases where evidence is scarce and myth grows with every year. Law enforcement's pursuit is unrelenting, driven by the promise that no crime, no matter how clever or audacious, can be allowed to go unanswered. Yet with each eliminated suspect, the case grows colder, and the true identity of D.B. Cooper slips further from reach. The gallery of suspects stands, a testament to the seriousness with which American justice confronts its mysteries. Behind each file is the weight of a possible life sentence, the threat of decades in federal prison, the hope for closure, and the reality that, in some crimes, the punishment may never be delivered. The legend of D.B. Cooper remains, anchored not just in his escape, but in the long shadow of unanswered questions and unclaimed justice. In the aftermath of the D.B. Cooper hijacking, America faces an epidemic of imitation. Between late 1971 and 1973, more than a dozen copycat hijackings unfold across the United States. Some perpetrators leap from planes with parachutes. Others issue ransom demands, inspired by Cooper's unprecedented escape. None replicate his vanishing act. Everyone is apprehended, tried in federal courts, and sentenced to long terms in prison. In the eyes of the justice system, each hijacker serves as an example. The cost of challenging the law is measured in decades lost to incarceration. Federal authorities react with urgency. The Federal Aviation Administration and Congress implement sweeping reforms. In 1973, universal passenger screening is mandated, and metal detectors appear in airports nationwide. Boeing redesigns the 727, installing a device known as the Cooper vane, which prevents the aft staircase from being deployed in flight. Airlines introduce air marshals, and flight crews receive new training for hijack prevention and response. These measures are not just security upgrades. They are warnings, institutionalized through law and engineering, that future skyjackers will face overwhelming obstacles and severe consequences. The fate of D.B. Cooper remains unknown, fueling debate among experts and the public. Some investigators believe he perished in the remote wilderness killed by the fall, the elements, or the weight of the ransom. Others argue he survived, slipped into obscurity, and spent his days watching the legend grow. No physical evidence, aside from a few decaying bills, ever proves either scenario. The lack of resolution ensures that punishment, in Cooper's case, is as much psychological as judicial. His name becomes a cipher, embodying the limits of law and the power of myth. The case becomes a touchstone in American culture. Films, television series, and books explore every possible ending. Theories proliferate in documentaries and online forums. The image of the anonymous man in a business suit, vanishing into the night, haunts generations of investigators and the public alike. The legend grows, even as the machinery of justice continues its pursuit. Copycat hijackers, unlike Cooper, are not remembered as legends. Their names are recorded in legal documents, their sentences carried out in penitentiaries across the country. Their stories serve the original purpose of punishment, deterrence, containment, and the reaffirmation of state authority. For them, the consequences are absolute and final. The D.B. Cooper mystery stands at the crossroads of law, legend, and societal memory. The severe punishment meted out to those who followed in his footsteps reinforces the message that justice, even when delayed or denied in one case, will be rigorously pursued in all others. The case endures, not because it is unsolved, but because it marks a moment when punishment, myth, and the American imagination collided, leaving a legacy as haunting as the crime itself. Decades slip by, investigators retire, new agents inherit the files, and technological advances promise fresh hope, but the central mysteries endure. The D.B. Cooper case remains the only unsolved air piracy in American history. No suspect has ever been confirmed, no body has ever been found. The $200,000 ransom, except for a handful of decaying bills unearthed on a river bank, has never surfaced in circulation. In 2016, after 45 years, the FBI formally closes its investigation. The file is archived, evidence boxed and stored. Yet, for all the resources devoted, thousands of interviews, field searches, forensic tests, and international alerts, the essential questions are left hanging. Did Cooper survive his jump into the freezing, stormy night over Washington? Was he an experienced criminal or simply a man who seized a rare opportunity? Did he vanish by skill, or did fate decide his end on that November night? The lack of resolution leaves a peculiar shadow over the machinery of justice. The system designed to catch, convict, and punish was pushed to its limits and found wanting in this singular case. Every year that passes without an answer only sharpens the sense of unfinished business. For law enforcement, the open questions are reminders that even the most relentless pursuit can sometimes end in silence. For the families of passengers and crew, and for the broader public, the mystery becomes part of collective memory. The unanswered questions fuel fascination and debate, keeping the legend alive long after the statute of limitations has expired. The story is retold in documentaries, true crime podcasts, and popular culture. The search for closure itself becomes a form of legacy, underscoring the limits of evidence and the enduring power of myth. The punishment, in Cooper's case, is ultimately denied. No trial, no sentencing, no resolution for the justice system. What remains is a haunting absence, a file marked unsolved, and the knowledge that some acts can escape the boundaries of law. The unanswered questions are a permanent testament to the limits of control and the enduring allure of the unknown. The story of D.B. Cooper refuses to fade. Long after the investigation has ended, his legend grows, crossing borders and generations. In films and documentaries, podcasts and books, his name becomes shorthand for the perfect mystery, a crime with no clear culprit and no conclusion. The image endures, a well-dressed man with a plan, defying the machinery of law and vanishing into history. In the public imagination, Cooper evolves into something more than a criminal. For some, he is an anti-hero, a symbol of rebellion against authority, risk, and the odds. For others, his story is a warning about the vulnerabilities of modern systems and the costs of uncertainty. He is discussed in classrooms, debated by amateur detectives, and immortalized in every retelling that emphasizes both the danger and the audacity of his actions. The case leaves a lasting mark on aviation security. After Cooper, passenger screening becomes mandatory. Airplanes are redesigned for safety. Federal air marshals become a fixture on flights. The system of justice adapts, closing loopholes exposed by a single hijacker's leap into the unknown. The punishments handed out to later copycats, swift, severe, and publicized, reinforce the determination to prevent such mysteries from happening again. Yet, the Cooper case also reveals the limits of law and order. Despite the best efforts of thousands, despite advancements in forensic science and international policing, some mysteries remain out of reach. The absence of closure becomes part of the story itself, fueling endless speculation and a unique form of collective curiosity. The power of the D.B. Cooper legend lies not just in the facts of the case, but in its questions. It challenges the belief that all crimes can be punished, all puzzles solved. It teaches that myth can have as much influence as truth, that, in the shadow between law and legend, a single act can inspire generations to wonder what really happened, and what it means when the final answer never comes. The D.B. Cooper case stands where fact and speculation meet. Decades of investigation have produced evidence, suspects, and theories, but never a final answer. His escape remains a riddle, his fate an open chapter. The questions left behind are more than details of a crime. They invite each of us to consider what it means when justice is never served, and mystery refuses to yield. Could D.B. Cooper have survived the storm, the leap, and the long journey to obscurity? Was he a meticulous planner, or simply a gambler who took a chance no one else dared? Did he find a new life beyond the reach of the law, or did the wilderness claim him within hours of his escape? The story endures because it remains unresolved. Its lessons are debated by experts, law enforcement, and ordinary people alike. Some see caution, others see inspiration, but everyone finds a piece of the mystery that resonates. The case is no longer just about a man who vanished, it's about the power of questions that outlive the facts, and the fascination of puzzles that justice cannot always solve. Now the mystery belongs to you. What do you believe happened in those dark woods above the Columbia River? What does the legend of D.B. Cooper reveal about risk, freedom, and the boundaries of the possible? In the end, the story survives because we keep asking what if. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries. The story of D.B. Cooper continues to captivate, not just for what is known, but for all that remains unknown. As we close this chapter, remember that the search for truth often reveals as much about ourselves and our world as it does about the past. If you found this exploration compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into history's strangest stories and the bizarre punishments that shaped our world. Share your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.